A Navy SEAL walked into the jungle with the Australians and didn't hear a human voice for 10 days. Not a whisper, not a grunt, not a single spoken word. For 10 straight days, 4 Australian SAS operators communicated entirely through touches and hand signals so subtle that the SEAL, a man who had graduated Army Ranger School, Raider School, and some of the most elite military training programs on Earth, missed half of them. He later told fellow SEAL veteran Jocko Willink on his podcast that he learned more about reconnaissance in those 10 days with the Australians than he had in every other school, every other course, every other training program he had ever attended in his entire military career. Combined, all of it. 10 days in the bush with the Australians rendered it all obsolete. When he returned to his unit, he did something that career military men almost never do. He admitted, openly and without qualification, that everything he thought he knew about operating in the jungle was wrong, and he was not alone. Because across Vietnam, in fire-base briefing rooms and classified after-action reports, in whispered conversations between Green Berets, and in the private journals of SEAL team leaders, a devastating consensus was forming. American Special Operations had spent 2 years developing doctrine, building schools, refining tactics, and bleeding men into the Vietnamese earth. And the Australians, a force so small it barely registered on organizational charts, had been doing it better from the very first day. This is the story of what happened when the most powerful military on Earth finally stopped talking and started listening. And what they heard changed Special Operations forever. The story begins not in Vietnam, but in the jungles of Malaya. A decade before the first American advisor ever set foot in Saigon, in 1955, while the United States was still building interstate highways and watching television in black and white, Australian soldiers were hunting communist insurgents through some of the densest jungle terrain on the planet. The Malayan Emergency, as the British called it, was a grinding 12-year counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas hiding in rainforest so thick that visibility dropped to single digits. And it was there, in the steam and rot of the Malayan Peninsula, that the Australian military learned lessons that would take America decades to absorb. The British military, leading the campaign, had recognized early what the Americans would struggle to accept in Vietnam. In a low-intensity jungle war, the skill and endurance of individual soldiers mattered far more than overwhelming firepower. Artillery shells meant nothing when you could not see your target. Air superiority was irrelevant when the canopy swallowed everything beneath it. What mattered was patience. What mattered was silence. What mattered was the ability to move through an environment that wanted to kill you without leaving a single trace that you had ever been there. Australian battalions rotated through Malaya for years. They patrolled the rubber plantations and the jungle fringes. They learned to track men through undergrowth so dense that machines could not penetrate it. They learned the discipline of the slow patrol, the agonizing art of moving through hostile terrain at speeds that made conventional commanders tear their hair out. And when Malaya wound down, they carried those lessons to the next jungle, Borneo, the Indonesian confrontation of 1963 to 1966. The Australian SAS, formed just 6 years earlier as a small company modeled on the British Special Air Service, deployed to the island's mountainous interior for its first real taste of active service. The jungle there was even worse than Malaya. Terrain so physically punishing that men who later served in Vietnam remembered Borneo as the harder deployment. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months. One Australian SAS patrol remained in the field for 89 consecutive days, living off short rations, navigating by compass through triple canopy that blocked the sun entirely, operating on both sides of the Indonesian border under conditions of absolute secrecy. 3 SAS men died in Borneo, none from enemy fire. The jungle itself was lethal enough. One was killed by a rogue elephant, dying an agonizing death over several days from wounds inflicted by the animal's tusk. But Borneo proved to be the crucible that forged the force America would encounter in Vietnam. During 4 months in the field, the Australian SAS conducted more than 40 patrols on both sides of the Indonesian border, almost half of which were purely reconnaissance. They were inserted by helicopter into landing zones, hacked from the canopy, or winched through gaps in the tree cover when no clearing existed. Every patrol was conducted entirely on foot, without resupply. Everything the men needed, food, water, ammunition, communications equipment, medical, supplies, they carried on their backs through terrain that clawed at them from every direction. The SAS tested and refined patrol techniques, insertion methods, communication protocols, and the cross-border operations codenamed Claret, secret incursions into Indonesian Kalimantan, where small teams gathered intelligence, or laid ambushes under conditions of absolute secrecy. These operations were so sensitive that their existence was denied for decades. The men who conducted them could tell no one what they had done or where they had been. They simply reappeared at base, thinner and quieter than when they left, and began preparing for the next mission. Above all, Borneo taught the philosophy that would define Australian operations for the next half-decade. They learned that the jungle was not an obstacle to be overcome with technology and aggression. It was a tool to be mastered, and mastery demanded a kind of surrender that the American military mind would find almost impossible to comprehend. You could not impose your will on the jungle. You could only learn its rhythms and become part of them. The men who understood this came home alive. The men who did not understand it frequently did not come home at all. When the Australian SAS arrived in Puak Tui Province in June of 1966, they carried this accumulated wisdom like ammunition. 3 Squadron was the first to deploy, setting up operations at the task force base at Nui Dat. They were a small force, never more than 150 men in country at any given time. 3 squadrons rotating through on year-long deployments, each consisting of a few dozen operators organized into 5-man patrols. On American organizational charts, they were barely a footnote. The Americans had been fighting in Vietnam for over a year by then. The Marines had waded ashore at Da Nang. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was conducting operations out of Bien Hoa. The 1st Cavalry Division was pioneering airmobile warfare. Tens of thousands of American troops were deployed across the country, backed by the most formidable military logistics chain in human history, supported by aircraft carriers and B-52 bombers and helicopter gunships, and an industrial capacity that could produce more ammunition in a week than most nations manufactured in a year. But the Australians had actually been in Vietnam longer than the American combat units. Since 1962, 4 years before the SAS arrived, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had been operating throughout the country. The AATTV, known simply as the Team, was a specialist unit of military advisors, initially just 30 officers and warrant officers, all hand-picked experts in counterinsurgency and jungle warfare. Most had served in the Malayan emergency. Their average age was 35. They were mature, experienced, and they understood something about fighting in jungles that the American military establishment was only beginning to grasp. The team's members were dispersed across South Vietnam in small groups, working as individuals or in pairs alongside South Vietnamese units, American Special Forces, and Montagnard Hill tribes. They operated from the far south to the demilitarized zone in the north, often commanding formations of Vietnamese soldiers in combat operations. Some worked with the controversial Phoenix program. Others served with U.S. Special Forces Mobile Strike Forces. A few operated in conditions so dangerous and so isolated that their daily survival was a matter of personal skill and nothing else. The AATTV's approach to training was fundamentally different from the American model. While American instructors emphasized rapid deployment of large numbers of troops, massive firepower, and decisive battles, the Australians concentrated on individual marksmanship, the independence of platoons from battalion headquarters, and small-scale patrols and ambushes. These differences frequently brought Australian advisors into direct conflict with their American superiors. The Australian philosophy of economy of effort was directly opposed to the American concept of concentration of force. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk had freely admitted at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962 that American armed forces knew little about jungle warfare. That admission had been the very reason Australia was asked to send advisors in the first place. And yet, when those advisors arrived and began teaching a different way of fighting, the institutional reaction was often resistance rather than receptivity. The AATTV would become the most decorated Australian unit of the entire war, its members receiving over 100 decorations, including 4 Victoria Crosses, the highest award for gallantry in the Commonwealth system. But their greatest contribution was not measured in medals. It was measured in the doctrine they carried and the lessons they demonstrated to every American they worked alongside. And the Americans were struggling. The Viet Cong refused to fight on American terms. They melted into the jungle after every engagement. They laid ambushes with mechanical precision and vanished before the artillery could respond. They built tunnel networks so vast and so deep that entire battalions could disappear underground. The American approach, find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with overwhelming firepower, was proving catastrophically inadequate against an enemy that simply refused to be found. The Australians watched all of this with the quiet attention of men who had seen it before, not in Vietnam, but in Malaya, in Borneo, in every jungle where Western armies had tried to fight insurgents using conventional methods and had learned, eventually and painfully, that the jungle demanded something different. The first American special operators to work alongside the Australians were members of the long-range reconnaissance patrol units attached to the 101st Airborne Division. In early September of 1967, the Australian SAS assumed responsibility for patrolling the area around the 1st Australian Task Force base, and many of those patrols included American LRRP personnel embedded with the Australian teams. What those Americans experienced would ripple through the special operations community for years. The differences were apparent from the moment preparation began. American units planned operations around helicopter insertions, radio schedules, artillery support coordinates, and extraction timelines. The Australians planned around silence. Their briefings were meticulous to the point of obsession, governed by what they called the 7 Ps, prior preparation and planning, prevents piss-poor performance. Every source of intelligence was examined. Every possible contingency was considered. Every piece of equipment was evaluated, not for its capability, but for the noise it might make, the scent it might carry, the signature it might leave. The patrols themselves were revelations. 5 men, sometimes 4, inserted by helicopter several kilometers from their actual patrol area. The helicopter would make multiple false insertions at other landing zones to confuse any enemy observer tracking its flight path. Once on the ground, the Australians disappeared. Not figuratively, literally. Within minutes of the helicopter departing, the patrol would have melted into the undergrowth with such completeness that a man standing 10 meters away would see nothing but vegetation. Then came the movement, and this was where American observers felt their understanding of infantry operations begin to fracture. Journalist Gerald Stone, who accompanied Australian patrols in 1966, described the experience as one of profound frustration. Patrols took as long as 9 hours to cover a single mile of terrain. The men moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, then proceeded again. Every footfall was placed with deliberation. Every pause extended until the natural sounds of the jungle had fully recovered from the disturbance of their movement. Birds kept singing. Insects kept droning. To any enemy listening post, the area where the Australians moved sounded perfectly normal, because the Australians had learned something that American doctrine had not yet grasped. In the jungle, sound was the primary detection mechanism, not sight, and the jungle's soundscape was an incredibly sensitive alarm system. A single snapped branch could carry hundreds of meters. A careless footstep on dry leaves could be heard by trained ears at distances that defied belief. The Viet Cong had been fighting in this environment for decades. Their listening posts could detect the difference between natural jungle noise and the disturbance pattern of a human patrol with almost supernatural accuracy. American patrols, even the elite ones, moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. They considered this cautious. The Australians moved at a fraction of that speed, 100 to 200 meters per hour, a pace so slow that American observers who witnessed it initially assumed there had been a miscommunication. That kind of speed meant a 1-kilometer movement consumed an entire day. A 5-kilometer mission required nearly a week. It seemed operationally absurd, but the results were not absurd, they were devastating. In 6 years of operations, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols across Phuoc Tuy Province and into Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Thuy provinces. They inflicted confirmed casualties of 492 enemy killed, with an additional 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses across the entire war totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. 580 men served in the SASR in Vietnam total. Those numbers represented the highest kill ratio of any unit, Australian or American, in the entire war. When contact did occur, the Australians fought with a ferocity that belied their methodical patience. The doctrine was simple and devastating. When contact was initiated by the enemy, the immediate response was a heavy volume of automatic fire, even if aimed only in the general direction of the threat. This served a dual purpose. It suppressed the enemy, buying precious seconds, and it created the illusion of a much larger force. A 5-man patrol pouring fire from every weapon simultaneously sounded like a platoon. The Viet Cong, trained to calculate enemy strength from the volume of incoming fire, consistently overestimated the size of Australian patrols. This misjudgment saved lives. Enemies who believed they had engaged 20 or 30 men were far less likely to press an attack than those who realized they faced only 5. The majority of Australian contacts were brutally short. Over 75% of all ambushes, patrol encounters, and security contacts lasted less than 20 minutes. The Australians hit hard, hit fast, and withdrew before the enemy could organize an effective response. They did not stay to count bodies or assess damage. They melted back into the jungle from which they had emerged and began the slow, silent process of putting distance between themselves and the contact point. As the war progressed, the Viet Cong adapted to Australian insertion techniques. After 5 years of SAS patrols operating from helicopter insertions, the enemy learned the patterns. By mid-1970, it was not unusual for Australian patrols to receive fire from Viet Cong positions shortly after landing. The Australians responded with characteristic adaptability. They developed what they called cowboy insertions. In a cowboy insertion, the helicopter carrying the patrol was followed by a second helicopter with an additional patrol. Both patrols would land and move together for 5 minutes. The second patrol would then halt and wait, while the first continued its mission. If no enemy contact materialized, the second patrol returned to the landing zone for extraction. If the Viet Cong were waiting at the insertion point, they now faced 2 patrols instead of 1, and the element of surprise shifted back to the Australians. This constant willingness to adapt, to treat every enemy countermeasure not as a problem, but as a puzzle to be solved, was embedded in Australian operational culture at a level that American doctrine struggled to match. The American Special Operations community could not ignore these figures. They demanded explanation. And the explanation, when it came, was as uncomfortable as it was undeniable. The Australian approach worked because it inverted every assumption that American doctrine held sacred. Where Americans valued speed, Australians valued patience. Where Americans relied on firepower to compensate for exposure, Australians used concealment to make firepower unnecessary. Where Americans measured success in body counts and territory seized, the Australians measured success in intelligence gathered and patrols completed without detection. Historian Albert Palazzo would later note that when the Australians entered the Vietnam War, they brought their own well-considered concept of war, and it was often directly contradictory to American methods. The 1st Australian Task Force employed light infantry tactics like deliberate patrolling, searching villages without destroying them, and sophisticated ambush and counter-ambush techniques that drew open criticism from senior American commanders. General William Westmoreland himself reportedly complained to the Australian commander that the task force was not being aggressive enough. The American measure of success, the body count, was held in contempt by Australian battalion commanders, who saw it as a metric that incentivized exactly the wrong kind of behavior. But nowhere was the doctrinal divide more visible or more consequential than in the realm of special operations, and it was here that the most painful American admissions would eventually emerge. The MAOCV Recondo School at Nha Trang was established in September of 1966 by the 5th Special Forces Group on the orders of General Westmoreland. It was designed to be the premier training institution for long-range reconnaissance patrol operators in Vietnam. A 3-week course of intensive instruction in map reading, intelligence gathering, weapons training, communications, helicopter operations, and small unit tactics. The final examination was not a written test. It was an actual combat patrol in enemy territory. Students called it the "You Bet Your Life" phase because enemy contact during the graduation mission was not a possibility. It was a near certainty. At least 2 students died during training. The school had a failure rate exceeding 1/3. The Recondo school was staffed by a 54-man Special Forces cadre, supported by Australian and South Korean liaison personnel. Over its 4 years of operation, the school processed 5,395 students. 3,515 graduated. Among them were 296 Koreans, 193 Thais, 130 Vietnamese, 22 Filipinos, and 18 Australians. The school produced some of the finest reconnaissance operators the American military had ever fielded. And yet, for all its intensity and all its graduates, the Recondo School was teaching a fundamentally different approach to jungle reconnaissance than what the Australians were practicing in the field. The distinction was not one of technical skill. American Recondo graduates were superb soldiers. The distinction was philosophical. The Recondo School trained men to be effective in short-duration, high-intensity reconnaissance missions. Get in, gather intelligence, get out. If contact was made, respond with overwhelming violence and extract immediately. It was an approach built on the assumption that detection was likely and that the response to detection should be firepower and speed. The Australian SAS trained men to be undetectable. Period. Their entire methodology was built on the premise that if you were detected, you had already failed, regardless of what happened next. Contact with the enemy was not a phase of the mission to be managed. It was a catastrophic failure to be prevented at all costs. The result was a completely different kind of operator. American reconnaissance teams were dangerous because they could fight. Australian reconnaissance teams were dangerous because they could not be found. The Australian SAS also provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School and later to the LRRP Training Wing at the AATTV, operated Van Keep Training Center from 1967 onward. Some SASR members served directly with ACVSOG units, with soldiers often rotating through on exchange with American Special Forces. These exchanges were where the real education happened, not in the classrooms, but in the field, where American operators could witness firsthand what Australian methods looked like in practice. The exchange program worked in both directions. American LRRP personnel from the 101st Airborne Division accompanied Australian patrols on operations. Australian operators joined American units to observe their methods and share expertise. But the imbalance in what each side had to teach was immediately apparent. The Americans could show the Australians the capabilities of their helicopter fleet, their artillery coordination procedures, their communications technology. The Australians could show the Americans how to become invisible, how to move through triple canopy jungle without making a sound, how to read the environment with a sensitivity that no technology could match, how to survive and fight and win with nothing but 5 men, their weapons, and an understanding of the jungle that took years, not weeks, to develop. The Australian contribution to the MACV Recondo School was particularly significant. The school's 54-man Special Forces cadre was supplemented by Australian and South Korean liaison officers who brought different perspectives to the curriculum. But the most important Australian contribution was not what they taught in the classroom. It was what they demonstrated in the field when Recondo graduates accompanied them on operations and discovered that the gap between what the school taught and what the Australians practiced was a gap not of degree, but of kind. Recondo training lasted 3 weeks. Australian SAS selection and training lasted 18 months. Recondo graduates were competent reconnaissance operators. Australian SAS operators were masters of an art form that had been refined through 3 separate jungle campaigns across 2 decades. The difference was not something that could be bridged by adding a week to the Recondo curriculum or modifying a lesson plan. It was a difference rooted in institutional memory, in operational experience accumulated over years and campaigns, in a military culture that had been shaped by jungle warfare. From its very foundations, Navy SEAL Roger Hayden's experience was among the most documented of these encounters, thanks to his appearance on the Jocko podcast years later. Hayden, then serving with SEAL Team 1, had invited an Australian SAS element to operate in his area of responsibility. At the time, Hayden and his fellow SEALs were operating out of a remote Vietnamese base camp, isolated, short on intelligence, conducting riverine insertions for ambushes and observation missions. His normal operations were water-based. The jungle was not his natural environment, and he knew it. The SEALs of that era were superb in the water. On land, in the suffocating green of the Vietnamese interior, they were operating at the edge of their training. When the Australians arrived, Hayden expected competent allies. What he got was a revelation that shattered his professional confidence. What followed was 10 days that fundamentally altered his understanding of what was possible in the jungle. The Australians did not speak. For the entire mission, 10 days of hand signals and touches so refined that they constituted a complete language. A hand on the shoulder meant stop. Pressure on the arm indicated direction. Finger configurations communicated distances, numbers of enemy, tactical instructions. The vocabulary was vast, and the delivery was so subtle, so economical in movement, that Hayden, watching from less than 2 meters away, missed half the signals entirely. He was watching men communicate in a language he did not know existed, conducting a conversation he could not hear about a war he was only beginning to understand. And the silence was not merely discipline, it was doctrine. It was the physical manifestation of a tactical philosophy that said any sound at all, was a liability. Hayden watched the Australians move through terrain that he had operated in for months and realized they were seeing things he had never noticed, reading the jungle in ways his training had never taught him, detecting disturbances in the environment, changes in bird calls, shifts in insect patterns, subtle signs of human passage, with a sensitivity that seemed almost preternatural. Where Hayden saw jungle, the Australians saw information. Every broken stem told a story. Every patch of disturbed earth contained a message. The jungle was not merely terrain to them. It was a book they had spent years learning to read. He came back from that patrol and made his admission. The Australian SAS, he said, were the best he had ever seen. Their fieldcraft was so good that it exposed the limitations of everything he had been taught. The SEALs, he acknowledged, had lost men because they lacked the fieldcraft preparation that the Australians took for granted. They had arrived in country with inadequate preparation, flying into remote bases with little turnover from the teams they replaced, and they had paid for it in blood. Hayden was not the only one reaching this conclusion. Across the American Special Operations community, a quiet recognition was spreading. The evidence was impossible to deny. The Australians were achieving results that American units could not replicate, despite having a fraction of the manpower, a fraction of the equipment, and none of the technological advantages that American forces took for granted. The uncomfortable truth was that American military doctrine was built on assumptions that the Vietnamese jungle systematically punished, the assumption that superior technology would compensate for environmental disadvantage, the assumption that speed and aggression were always preferable to patience and concealment, the assumption that larger forces were inherently more effective than smaller ones, the assumption that the response to failure was more resources rather than different methods. The Australians had learned different lessons. Their military tradition, forged in the Malayan emergency and tempered in Borneo, had taught them that jungle warfare demanded adaptation, not domination. They respected the environment as a neutral factor that could be turned to advantage by anyone willing to learn its rules, and they respected their enemy with a professional attention that American forces often lacked. American soldiers in Vietnam frequently used dehumanizing terms for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. The terminology ranged from neutral military shorthand to outright racial contempt. The underlying assumption, often unstated but consistently present, was that the enemy was inferior, technologically backward, to be destroyed through superior American firepower. The Australians operated under no such illusions. They had studied their enemy meticulously. Viet Cong tactics were analyzed for what they could teach, not dismissed as primitive. Enemy successes were examined for operational lessons rather than explained away as luck or American error. The Australians never underestimated the fighters they faced, and that professional respect translated directly into tactical caution that saved Australian lives, while American patrols walked into ambushes that better intelligence and more careful movement might have avoided. The institutional resistance to these lessons was immense. Individual Americans recognized the value of Australian methods and advocated for their adoption. Officers who had served alongside the Australians wrote detailed recommendations. After-action reports documented the disparity in results with uncomfortable clarity. But institutions do not change because evidence demands change. They change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. And in Vietnam, that cost was distributed across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic event that might have forced immediate reform. Each ambush was a separate incident. Each detected patrol was an individual failure that could be attributed to specific circumstances rather than systemic flaws. The pattern was visible only in aggregate statistics that senior commanders had professional reasons not to examine closely. General Westmoreland wanted aggressive operations. He wanted body counts. He wanted visible progress. The Australian model of slow, patient, nearly invisible operations that produced intelligence rather than spectacular engagements did not fit the narrative that MACV headquarters needed to project. But the war continued to teach its lessons whether anyone wanted to learn them or not. The Australian approach was not merely holding ground. It was achieving something that American forces had not managed anywhere in Vietnam: genuine tactical dominance over a defined area of operations. Phuoc Tuy Province, which had been a Viet Cong stronghold before the Australian arrival, was progressively brought under government control through a combination of methodical patrolling, village-level engagement, and SAS operations that degraded enemy capability through intelligence collection and precisely targeted ambushes. By the time the Australians withdrew their last combat units In 1971, Highway 15, the main route running through Phuoc Tuy between Saigon and Vung Tau, was open to unescorted civilian traffic. That achievement, seemingly modest, represented something that hundreds of thousands of American troops with unlimited firepower had not been able to replicate in their own areas of responsibility. The Viet Cong themselves provided perhaps the most telling assessment. Enemy documents captured throughout the war revealed a consistent pattern. American forces were regarded as predictable, detectable, and vulnerable to ambush at carefully selected locations. The standard engagement protocol was aggressive. Hit the Americans hard in the first 30 seconds, then withdraw through prepared routes before artillery arrived. For the Australians, the guidance was fundamentally different. The enemy's own operational documents acknowledged that Australian patrols were extremely difficult to detect. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience exceeded anything other Western forces had demonstrated. The recommended approach was avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because Australians were more likely to detect the trap before entering it. If contact was unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw. The Viet Cong had a specific term for the Australian SAS Ma Rung. It translated roughly to phantoms of the jungle or jungle ghosts. The term carried supernatural overtones that exceeded ordinary military respect. The enemy was not merely cautious about the Australians. They were afraid in ways they were never afraid of Americans. This fear had measurable consequences. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did enter, their behavior changed completely, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. The broader Australian military presence in Phuoc Tuy told the same story through different evidence. The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, just weeks after the SAS first arrived, had already demonstrated what Australian soldiers could achieve when they adapted their doctrine to Vietnamese conditions. A single company from the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, outnumbered roughly 10-1, fought off a regimental strength assault through a combination of disciplined fire, coordinated artillery support, and the kind of small unit cohesion that Australian training emphasized above all else. 18 Australians were killed and 24 wounded, but at least 245 Viet Cong died in the battle. It was a decisive engagement that allowed the Australians to establish dominance over Phuoc Tuy province and demonstrated that their approach to infantry warfare, built on individual soldier quality rather than mass, could produce results under the most extreme pressure. Long Tan was not an SAS battle. It was fought by conventional infantry, but it illustrated the same underlying philosophy that made the SAS so effective. The Australians invested in their soldiers as individuals. They trained them to think independently, to react instinctively, to function without constant direction from higher command. An Australian rifle section pinned down in the rubber plantation at Long Tan did not wait for orders. It fought. It maneuvered. It made decisions at the lowest possible level. This was the product of a military culture that trusted its soldiers in ways that the American system, with its emphasis on centralized command and overwhelming support, often did not. The SAS took this principle to its extreme. 5 men, alone in enemy territory, days away from any possible reinforcement, making life and death decisions with no one to consult and no one to blame. The men who thrived in these conditions were not ordinary soldiers. They were selected through a process so demanding that only 1 in 12 candidates survived it, and even those who passed selection entered a training pipeline that lasted 18 months, 3 times longer than American Special Forces training of the same era. The psychological demands of this kind of warfare left marks that no after-action report could capture. Men who spent weeks at a time in a state of total sensory alertness, suppressing every normal human impulse, becoming something closer to animal than soldier in the way they processed their environment, did not simply switch back to normal when the helicopter lifted them out. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in the jungle followed them home. The emotional suppression that prevented a careless gesture from betraying their position made intimacy difficult, sometimes impossible. The predatory awareness that could detect an enemy fighter's presence through a change in insect noise made the ordinary chaos of civilian life feel like an assault on every sense. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The same transformation that made them devastatingly effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to think like predators, and predators do not easily return to the herd. The Viet Cong called them jungle ghosts, but ghosts are creatures caught between worlds, unable to fully inhabit either one. Some Australian veterans never found their way back completely from the jungle they had learned to call home. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations, not completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops had departed, reached conclusions that contradicted everything American military doctrine had assumed. Small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. Indigenous tracking methods adapted to jungle warfare provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Psychological warfare targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects wildly disproportionate to the resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep and clear operation. That report was classified and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing findings that suggested their most effective allies in Vietnam had succeeded by doing virtually everything differently than American forces. But the lessons, suppressed and classified and buried, did not die. They simply went underground, like the Viet Cong tunnel networks that had frustrated American operations for years. And when they resurfaced, they reshaped the American military in ways that are still visible today. When the United States military finally began serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the reforms incorporated principles that the Australians had demonstrated effective 2 decades earlier. The emphasis on small unit tactics and individual operator judgment, the prioritization of stealth and patience over firepower and aggression, the understanding that cultural adaptation and environmental integration could achieve results that technology alone could not deliver. Delta Force, established in 1977. The expansion of the SEAL teams, the creation of the 75th Ranger Regiment from the LRRP, and Ranger units that had absorbed Australian methodology through the Recondo School and Direct Field Exchange. The entire modern apparatus of American unconventional warfare incorporates lessons that were available for learning in 1966. The methods were there. The evidence was overwhelming. The Australians were willing to teach. The institutions were not willing to learn. The delay between demonstration and adoption was measured not in months, but in decades. Techniques that Australian operators employed successfully in 1967 did not become standard American practice until the 1980s, and, in some cases, the 1990s. By some estimates, the time lost in adopting these lessons contributed to casualties that better methods might have prevented. The arithmetic is impossible to calculate with precision. How many American patrols walked into ambushes that Australian movement discipline might have avoided? How many soldiers died because their units smelled like department stores instead of jungle rot? How many operations failed because American doctrine demanded speed when the situation demanded patience? The numbers will never be known. But the pattern was clear enough to haunt the men who recognized it. The Australian SAS went on to prove their methods in other theaters. In East Timor in 1999, they spearheaded the International Intervention Force, serving as the eyes and ears of the peacekeeping operation just as they had in Vietnam. In Afghanistan, after 2001, they were among the first Allied forces on the ground, fielding up to 1,100 personnel in the first 6 months of Operation Enduring Freedom. In Iraq in 2003, an SAS squadron operated deep behind enemy lines in the Western Desert, conducting some of the first ground actions of the war. In each deployment, the core principles remained the same: small teams, superior fieldcraft, patience over firepower, adaptation over orthodoxy. Today, special operations forces around the world study Australian SAS methods from Vietnam as textbook examples of unconventional warfare at its most effective. The patrol doctrines, the tracking techniques, the long-range reconnaissance methodology all have been incorporated into the standard curriculum at Fort Bragg and Coronado and every other special operations training facility in the Western world. What was once classified as too controversial to acknowledge has become foundational doctrine. Yet something remains difficult to replicate. Modern special operations can copy Australian tactics. They struggle to replicate Australian psychology. The transformation that turned sheep farmers and stockmen from rural Queensland into jungle phantoms was not merely a product of training. It was a product of institutional culture, of a military tradition that valued adaptation over orthodoxy, that prized results over procedure, that understood that the most dangerous enemy was not the man with the gun, but the assumption that went unquestioned. Roger Hayden, the Navy SEAL who spent 10 silent days in the bush with the Australians, took something home with him that no training manual could capture. He learned that the gap between American and Australian special operations was not a gap of equipment or resources or even individual skill. It was a gap of philosophy. The Americans had spent 2 years building a doctrine that assumed the jungle was an obstacle to be overcome. The Australians had spent a decade building a doctrine that assumed the jungle was a weapon to be wielded. That was what the SEAL meant when his words echoed through the classified corridors of the Special Operations community. That was the admission that no one wanted to make, but everyone who had seen the Australians' work already knew. 2 years of doctrine, 2 years of schools and programs and operational refinements, 2 years of men learning and bleeding and dying to develop an approach to jungle warfare, and 10 days with the Australians had rendered all of it insufficient. Not wrong, necessarily, not useless, but insufficient, because the Australians were operating at a level that American training had not yet imagined was possible, a level where silence was not a technique, but a way of being, where patience was not a tactic, but a philosophy, where the jungle was not the enemy's territory, but your own. 580 men served in the Australian SAS in Vietnam. They conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They accounted for over 500 enemy killed. They lost 6 men total to all causes. Those numbers are not statistics. They are the arithmetic of a doctrine that worked, written in the most unforgiving language war has to offer. The Pentagon knew the numbers. They classified them. The enemy knew the numbers. They feared them. The American special operators who fought alongside the Australians knew the numbers best of all. And what those numbers told them was something their training had never prepared them to hear. That the most powerful military on earth still had something to learn from 150 men who smelled like the jungle, moved like shadows, and fought like ghosts. Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, the soldiers who were dismissed as too small, too slow, and too few, until they proved themselves masters of a kind of warfare that no amount of money or technology or institutional prestige could replicate. That is their legacy. That is what they taught. That is what the Americans eventually, painfully, and at a cost measured in years and lives, finally learned to accept. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the first Australian unit to arrive and the last to leave, served for a decade in country. They won 4 Victoria Crosses and over 100 decorations. The SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols over 6 years and lost 6 men to all causes. Combined, these forces, never numbering more than a few hundred at any given time, left a mark on the American military establishment that no force 10 times their size could have achieved through conventional means. They did it not by fighting harder than the Americans. They did it by fighting smarter, by refusing to accept that the American way was the only way, by proving, patrol after patient patrol, that the jungle rewarded those who listened to it and destroyed those who tried to shout it down. The question was never whether the lessons were available. They were available from the first day the Australians set foot in Phuoc Tuy province. The question was whether the institutions that needed those lessons most would be willing to accept them. It took 2 years in the jungle for American Special Operations to admit what 10 days with the Australians had made obvious. Some lessons can only be learned in silence, and the Australians had been teaching that lesson since the day they arrived. 5 men at a time, 100 meters per hour, one patrol after another, vanishing into the green and emerging weeks later with intelligence that changed the shape of the war. The phantoms of the jungle, the soldiers who proved that less could be more, that silence could be louder than artillery, and that the most powerful weapon in the jungle was not carried on a man's back, but lived inside his discipline and his patience. Ma Rung, the ghosts who taught an empire how to fight,